She stood by the window as she had every evening for 6 months, watching the long drive for a carriage that never paused. Tonight the carriage came, glossy black and familiar, lanterns swinging through the dusk. Her heart lurched. She pressed her fingers to the cold glass, leaning forward so that her breath misted the pane. She did not care if the footman saw. She only wanted him to look up. He did not. The Duke of Ashford stepped down from the carriage without a single glance toward the house. His dark head was bent toward his steward, his shoulders tight beneath a greatcoat. He walked inside and straight past the entry hall where she stood, the soft rustle of her evening gown the only greeting. By the time she gathered herself to speak, his boots were already fatting on the staircase, and the library door closed with a quiet, final click. Serafina remained beside the window until the last light bled from the sky. The candles were not yet lit, and so the servants found her in near darkness, her hands still cupping the glass as if she could hold the shape of a hope that had already gone. She had been a bride of spring, brought to Ashford Hall with lilacs in her hair and a dowry that saved her family from ruin. The Duke, Cassian Ashford, had stood beside her at the altar like a man carved from granite. He had spoken his vows clearly, kissed her cheek without warmth, and withdrawn to his study before the wedding breakfast had ended. That night she had sat alone in the Duchess's chambers, brushing her hair with strokes that shook, telling herself that time would soften him. Time did not soften him. 6 months passed, and Cassian Ashford remained a stranger who shared her name. He was never cruel with words, never raised his voice. He simply looked through her as though she were a decorative piece of furniture he had inherited with the estate. At meals, he answered her gentle questions with monosyllables. When she entered a room, his attention did not shift. Only once, at a small dinner party, did she see his eyes flicker with something other than indifference. And that was when his elegant cousin, Lady Marguerite, leaned close to murmur something that made his jaw tighten and his gaze sweep the table to land, for one searing moment, on Serafina's face. She had felt stripped bare, and she did not understand why. In the beginning, she tried. Every morning she ordered fresh flowers for his study. Every evening she dressed carefully, choosing gowns the color of soft skis and sea foam, hoping he would notice. She learned his favorite dishes from the cook and had them served on silver platters. She read the agricultural journals he left scattered about so that she might ask an intelligent question about the tenant farms. She waited in the corridor for his return from riding, a shawl pulled around her shoulders, her smile ready. He never noticed the gowns. He never touched the flowers. He answered her questions about the tenants with curt, factual replies that left no room for conversation. And when she waited in the corridor, he only inclined his head, his face as empty as the moon, and walked past her without breaking stride. It was the small cruelties of absence that undid her slowly, like a river wearing down a stone. The way he never said her name unless required. The way his eyes never rested on her face long enough to see the hope dying there. The way the servants began to mirror his disregard, their curtsies a beat too shallow, their glances a touch too long. She was the Duchess of Ashford, and she was invisible. One afternoon, a month before the first frost, she was arranging roses in the morning room when she heard voices in the adjoining corridor. The door was ajar, and she recognized her husband's low, measured tone and the higher, sharper cadence of Lady Marguerite. "You cannot keep punishing her for what her family did," Marguerite said, her voice threaded with a strange, honeyed pity. "The poor girl is trying so desperately. Everyone sees it." There was a pause, then Cassian's voice, rougher than she had ever heard it. "She is a Montclair, there is no erasing that. I gave her my name for duty's sake. She cannot expect more. And if she does, then she is a fool." Serafina's hand had frozen around a rose stem. A thorn drove deep into her thumb, but she did not feel it until she looked down and saw the bright bead of blood blooming against her skin. She lifted her thumb to her lips and tasted salt and copper. The voices moved away. The house settled back into silence. She did not cry. She had spent too many nights crying already. Instead, she wrapped her bleeding thumb in a handkerchief and set the roses aside. Something in her chest, something that had fluttered weakly for months, finally stopped flapping and lay still. That evening, she did not wait by the window. She began to change. It was so quiet at first that even she hardly noticed. She stopped ordering new gowns and wore the simple ones she had brought from home, the ones with practical seams and deep pockets. She rose at dawn and walked the estate grounds, not waiting for him to join her. She visited the tenants and learned their names, their children's names, their worries about the coming harvest. She listened as they spoke of flooded fields and an ailing cow, and she wrote careful notes that she gave to the steward herself. The steward, a gruff man named Hale, looked startled at first, then gradually approving. She discovered the old library, a forgotten room at the end of the east wing where the shelves sagged with books no one had touched in a generation. Dust rose like ghostly fingers when she opened the first volume, but she did not mind. She hired a footman to carry the books to the sunlight, and she spent hours sorting them, her sleeves rolled up, her hair slipping from its pins. The smell of old paper and leather replaced the scent of the roses she no longer cut. She did not notice at first that the Duke was watching her. It began as a flicker at the edge of her awareness, a shadow that lingered a moment too long in the library doorway, the feeling of eyes on her back as she knelt in the garden, a trowel in her hand, while she planted the lavender cuttings an elderly tenant had given her. When she turned, no one was there. Cassian Ashford did not understand what had unsettled the quiet rhythms of his house. At first, he was simply aware that the Duchess was no longer where he expected her to be. She was not in the corridor when he returned. She did not appear at dinner with careful questions. One evening, he entered the dining room to find her chair empty, and when he sent a servant to inquire, the reply came that her Grace had already taken a tray in the library. He sat through the meal alone. The food tasted of nothing. He told himself it was annoyance at the disruption of routine. Then he began to hear things. A farmer's wife blessing the Duchess for the new remedies she had brought for a child's cough. His steward mentioning that her Grace had renegotiated the dairy contract to the estate's advantage. The head gardener remarking that the Duchess had discovered a lost rose variety in the old beds and had propagated it herself with a patience the man found remarkable. Cassian heard these things and felt a curious disconnect, as though people were speaking of a woman he had never met. The wife he knew was a quiet, hopeful ghost who hovered at the edges of his life. This woman, the one they described, sounded vivid and certain. He did not know which version was the truth. He saw her one afternoon from the window of his study. She was standing in the kitchen garden with a tall, fair-haired man whose sleeves were rolled to the elbows. The man was gesturing toward a row of raised beds, his face animated, and the Duchess was laughing. The sound drifted up to Cassian's window, light and unguarded, a laugh he had never once drawn from her. He watched the man lean closer to point at a plant, and he saw the Duchess's expression soften with interest. Something tightened in Cassian's chest, a hot, unfamiliar coil of feeling. He turned from the window and forced his attention back to the estate reports, but the numbers blurred. He did not know the man's name. He wanted very badly to know it. The man was Julian Cross, a botanist and landscape designer with a quiet reputation that was beginning to spread through the county. Serafina had written to him on the advice of the head gardener, and he had arrived with a cart full of rare seedlings and a manner so gentle that it seemed to put even the shyest sparrow at ease. He spoke of plants as if they were old friends, and he listened to Serafina's ideas with an attention so complete that she sometimes forgot to be self-conscious. Julian did not know the intricacies of her marriage. He saw only a serious young duchess with soil on her gloves and a sadness behind her eyes that she tried very hard to hide. He made no advances, offered no impropriety. He simply treated her as if her thoughts mattered, and that was a gift she had not received in a very long time. They spent mornings together in the greenhouse coaxing seedlings into new soil. Serafina found herself talking about things she had never spoken aloud. Her childhood garden at her family's now lost estate, her mother's favorite peonies, the way she missed the sound of a house that felt like a home. Julian listened and did not offer pity. He offered only quiet companionship and the occasional dry remark that made her laugh. Those laughs felt foreign in her throat at first, but they grew easier. Cashin began to notice her absence in a way that no longer felt like simple confusion. The house seemed larger, quieter, wrong. He would enter a room expecting to find her reading by the fire and find only an empty chair. He would pause outside the library and hear the soft rustle of pages and the murmur of her voice as she read aloud to herself, and he would stand there, listening, unable to make himself enter. He did not know what he would say. The first sharp bite of jealousy came on an evening when he returned early from a trip to the village. He walked through the garden to clear his head, and he saw them sitting on the stone bench beneath the ancient yew tree. The lanterns had been lit, and the golden light fell across Serafina's hair, which she had loosened from its usual severe knot. Julian Cross was beside her, and he was handing her a small, leather-bound book. Their fingers brushed, and Serafina smiled. Cashin's hands curled into fists at his sides. The feeling that surged through him was ugly and possessive and utterly irrational. He wanted to stride across the grass and pull her away, to demand what right that man had to sit so close to his wife. But he had no right to demand anything. He had given her 6 months of coldness and silence. He had told his cousin she was a fool to expect more. The memory of his own words burned in his throat. He turned and walked back into the house without being seen. That night he lay awake, staring at the canopy, and for the first time he allowed himself to think the thought he had been pushing away for weeks. He did not know his wife, and the fault was entirely his. Autumn arrived with a chill that crept under doors and through the cracks of old windows. Serafina felt the cold more keenly than usual. She tired easily, and there were mornings when the scent of breakfast made her stomach turn. She dismissed it as a passing ailment, but when the nausea persisted and her maid began to look at her with knowing, careful eyes, Serafina faced the truth she had been avoiding. She was carrying the Duke's child. The realization came to her in the greenhouse, surrounded by the tender shoots Julian had helped her plant. She sank onto a wooden crate and pressed her hands to her stomach, her heart racing. A child, a tiny, innocent life that had no part in the coldness between its parents. A child who would be an Ashford, heir to all this silence and distance. She did not know whether to weep or to laugh. In the end, she did both, very quietly, so that the greenhouse plants were the only witnesses. She decided she would not tell him. The decision hardened inside her with a painful clarity. She had spent months trying to bridge a distance he had made clear he did not wish to cross. If she told him about the child, he would feel duty-bound. He would perhaps offer a formal acknowledgement, a careful arrangement of nannies and nurseries that felt as cold as the rest of the house. She could not bear to see a child raised in the same polite emptiness she had endured. And she could not bear to see his face when he learned of the baby and felt only obligation, not joy. So she would wait. She would continue her quiet work on the estate. She would grow stronger in herself. And when the spring came and she could travel safely, she would leave for the small cottage by the sea that had belonged to her mother. She would raise the child there, in salt air and sunlight, and if the Duke never noticed her absence, then that would be its own answer. She told no one, not even Julian. She began to wear looser gowns, inventing reasons. She ate carefully, rested when her body demanded it, and carried the secret beneath her heart like a fragile flame. The estate's autumn harvest festival came on a day of crisp gold light. Serafina had planned it herself, working with the tenants to arrange long tables, barrels of cider, and a space for dancing on the grass. She wore a gown of deep russet that matched the turning leaves, and she had pinned her hair up with a ribbon the color of sunset. She felt the weight of her secret but also something unfamiliar, a quiet pride. The festival was hers. The laughter of the tenants, the music of the fiddler. The children racing between the tables, all of it she had built. Cashin arrived late, standing at the edge of the gathering with his hands clasped behind his back. He watched his wife move through the crowd, and he felt as though he were seeing her for the first time. She did not hover or fret. She moved with a calm grace, stopping to speak to a farmer's wife, kneeling to admire a child's ribbon-tied kitten. There was color in her cheeks and a light in her eyes that he had never seen in the dim corridors of Ashford Hall. When the dancing began, he saw Julian Cross step forward and bow to the Duchess. She hesitated, then took his hand. They moved into the dance, and Cashin felt his chest constrict. She was beautiful when she danced. Not just her face or her form, but the way she smiled, the way she laughed when Julian turned her a little too quickly. The tenants clapped and cheered, and Cashin saw the way Julian looked at her, the open, unhidden admiration in the man's eyes. He could not bear it. Before he knew what he was doing, he had crossed the grass and tapped Julian's shoulder with a touch that was just short of aggressive. "May I?" It was not a question. Julian stepped back, his expression shifting to careful neutrality. Serafina looked up at her husband, and for the first time in months, her gaze was not soft. It was guarded, wary, as though she were bracing for a blow. Cashin took her hand. The fiddler, sensing the shift, struck up a slower tune. They moved together in the dance, his hand firm at her waist, her steps perfectly measured but distant. She did not smile. "You are well acquainted with Mr. Cross," Cashin said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "He is a friend," she replied evenly. "He respects my company. It is a rare quality in this house." The words landed like a blade. He felt it slide between his ribs, and his grip on her hand tightened fractionally. "I have not been what I should have been." She looked at him then, her eyes searching his face for something she did not seem to find. "No," she said quietly, "you have not." The dance ended. She stepped back, curtsied with perfect formality, and walked away into the crowd. Cashin stood motionless, the music swirling around him, and he knew with a sick, sinking certainty that he was losing something he had never realized he possessed. The days that followed were a slow torture. He began to seek her out, but she was never where he looked. She ate at odd hours, walked the fields with the steward, spent long afternoons in the greenhouse with Julian Cross. When Cashin left a book on the library table that he thought she might enjoy, he found it later, untouched, on the same spot. When he instructed the cook to prepare her favorite dishes, the plates returned barely disturbed. He was a man who had always commanded authority, yet he could not command a single moment of his wife's attention. One evening, he found the door to his late sister's room ajar. The chamber had been kept closed since Rosalind's death 4 years earlier, a shrine of grief and guilt that he could not bear to enter. That night, drawn by a pull he could not name, he stepped inside. The room smelled of dried lavender and old sorrow. Rosalind's possessions remained as she had left them. The silver hairbrush on the vanity, the watercolor sketches pinned to the wall, the small, ribbon-tied journals stacked beside her bed. Cashin had never read them. He had not been able to. But tonight, driven by a desperate need to understand something, anything, he picked up the topmost volume and opened it. Rosalind's handwriting was delicate and slanted, the script of a girl who had once been full of laughter. He turned the pages, reading fragments of parties and dresses and dreams, until a name caught his eye. Montclair. His heart stumbled. He read the entry, dated 2 months before Rosalind's ruin. "Evelina warned me today. She said the Montclair family cannot be trusted, that their eldest son means to disgrace me. But I saw Sira Montclair at the ball, and she was so kind. She told me to be careful of false friends. She said people are not always what they seem. I wonder if she meant Evelina. I am so confused. Evelina has always been my dearest cousin, but Sira's eyes were so honest. I do not know whom to believe." Cashin's hands began to shake. He read on. "I wrote to Sira yesterday, asking her advice. Evelina found the letter and was furious. She said Sira is jealous of our family and will twist my words. I am frightened. I wish my brother were not so blind where Evelina is concerned." The next entry was dated a week later. It is done. The rumor is everywhere and Sierra's brother is named as the source of my disgrace. But it was not him, I know it now. Evelina came to me last night and she was smiling. She said, "You chose the wrong friend, Rosalind. Now you will see what happens to those who trust Montclair's." It was her. It was always her. She wanted Cashin for herself and she used the Montclair name to destroy me. I must tell my brother, I must. The entry ended there. Rosalind had fallen ill shortly after, a fever that swept through her with terrifying speed. She had never had the chance to tell him anything. Cashin sat on the edge of his sister's bed, the journal open in his lap, and the truth crashed over him like a wave of ice water. He had married Serafina believing she was part of the family that had ruined his sister. He had let Marguerite whisper poison into his ear for years, shaping his grief into a weapon. He had punished an innocent woman for a crime she had not only not committed, but had tried to prevent. And he had done it with cold, methodical cruelty. He thought of Serafina at the window night after night, waiting for a man who would not look at her. He thought of her quiet attempts, her trembling smiles, the way she had slowly withered under his indifference. He thought of the dance, the guarded look in her eyes, the way she had said, "You have not." He pressed the heels of his hands to his eyes and let out a sound that was half groan, half sob. He had to find her. He had to tell her. He had to fall on his knees and beg for the forgiveness he did not deserve. He rose and went in search of her, but the house gave him nothing. Her chambers were empty. The library was dark. The greenhouse door was locked. A housemaid, flustered by the wild look in his eyes, stammered that her grace had left that afternoon, that she had taken a small trunk in the carriage, and that she had left a note. "Where?" Cashin demanded. "The Dowager Cottage, your grace, by the sea." He did not wait for a horse to be saddled. He took the fastest mount from the stables and rode through the thickening dusk, the wind screaming past his ears. Rain began to fall, cold and relentless, plastering his coat to his back, but he did not slow. The miles blurred. The road turned to mud and then to sand. And finally he saw the small, whitewashed cottage huddled against the cliffside, a single light burning in its window. He dismounted, his legs nearly buckling, and crossed the wet grass in 3 strides. He pounded on the door with his fist. It opened. Serafina stood in the doorway, a shawl around her shoulders, her hair loose and damp from the sea air. She looked at him, and her face went very still. "Cashin." He had never heard her say his name like that before. Not with hope or longing, but with a weary, patient acceptance, as though she had been expecting this moment of reckoning and had already made her peace with it. "I know," he said, and his voice cracked. "I know everything, Marguerite, the letters, what you tried to do for Rosalind." Her expression did not change. She simply stepped aside and let him enter the cottage. The room was small and plain, a fire burning in the hearth, her small trunk open in the corner. He saw a folded shawl, a book of poetry, a single pressed flower. He turned to face her, and the words he had rehearsed on the ride dissolved into nothing. He was a duke, a man of power and land, and he had never felt so small in his life. "I have been blind," he said. "I listened to lies because they were easier than facing the truth. I blamed you for a hurt you never caused, and I let my grief turn me into a man who could stand by and watch his wife break without lifting a hand." She said nothing. The firelight flickered across her face, and he saw the glimmer of unshed tears in her eyes. "I have no right to ask for your forgiveness," he went on, his voice raw. "I have no right to stand here and speak to you at all, but I am asking. I am asking because I love you, Sierra. I think I have loved you for a long time, and I was too proud and too wounded to see it. I love you, and I am terrified that I have realized it too late." Her breath caught. A single tear slipped down her cheek, and she did not wipe it away. "I was going to leave you," she whispered. "I was going to raise our child alone because I believed you could never love either of us." The words hit him like a physical blow. He stared at her, his gaze dropping to her stomach, to the gentle curve that her loose gown had hidden. The child. Their child. "You are with child," he breathed. "Yes," her voice trembled. "And I was so afraid. Afraid you would look at this baby the way you always looked at me, as though I were a burden you had to endure." He crossed the room before he knew he was moving. He dropped to his knees in front of her, his hands hovering near her waist, not daring to touch until she gave him permission. The rain beat against the windows and the fire hissed, and all the cold, empty years seemed to press in around them. "I will spend the rest of my life proving myself to you," he said, his voice breaking. "I will be the husband you deserved from the start. I will be a father who holds his child and thanks God for the gift you have given him. I will tear down every wall I built, and I will stand in the rubble and beg you to stay. Please, Sira, please don't leave me." She looked down at him, the Duke of Ashford on his knees in a windswept cottage, rain-soaked and shattered. She saw the tears on his face, the desperation in his eyes, the raw, unguarded love that had broken through at last. She bent and placed her hand on his cheek. "Cashin." "Yes. I have waited so long to hear you say my name like that." He closed his eyes and turned his face into her palm, his shoulders shaking. She sank down to her knees in front of him, and he gathered her into his arms with a gentleness that felt like a prayer. She buried her face in his shoulder, and for a long while they simply held each other, the rain and the sea and the fire bearing witness. Spring came to Ashford Hall in a riot of blossom and new grass. The gardens that Serafina and Julian had planned together burst into color, and the greenhouse was filled with the scent of damp earth and growing things. Julian had departed with a warm handshake and a quiet smile, and Cashin had thanked him with a sincerity that surprised them both. The dowager cottage by the sea was not emptied but kept ready, for Serafina said she wanted their child to know the sound of waves. Cashin agreed, and he began to ride there with her when the weather was fine, sitting on the cliffside with her hand in his, talking of nothing and everything. Lady Marguerite had been quietly banished to a distant estate, her protests silenced by the evidence of her treachery. Cashin did not speak of her again. He focused instead on the family that was growing around him, the tenants who smiled when the Duchess passed, the servants who had learned to respect her gentle authority, and the wife who no longer waited by the window. She did not need to wait. He was always home before dusk. One evening, as the last light of a long summer day slanted through the nursery window, Cashin stood beside his wife and looked down at the cradle where their son slept. The baby's fist was curled against his cheek, and his breath came in tiny, peaceful sighs. Serafina leaned into Cashin's side, her head finding its familiar place against his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her, drawing her close. "I used to stand at the window and wonder if you would ever look at me," she said softly. "Now I stand at the window and watch you come home, and I still feel that same leap in my heart. The difference is, now I know you are coming to me." He pressed a kiss to her hair, his throat tight. "I will always come to you, Sira, every day of my life." She smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had stopped hopping for love and had found it anyway, waiting for her all along. Outside the window, the gardens bloomed in the golden light, and inside, the house was full of warmth at last.